I think anybody who comes out of a business school should have a stamp on his or her forehead that says warning, like a skull and crossbones that says warning, not prepared to manage. Because they've been trained not to manage, they've been trained to calculate.
Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fay. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision and the culture of healthcare systems. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. This is Patty Fay. My guest today is a Canadian collector of beaver sculptures and one of the most renowned business experts on the planet. Professor Henry Mintzberg is the Cleghorn Professor of Management Studies at McGill University in Montreal, and he's the recipient of 21 honorary degrees from universities around the world. He's the author of 20 books and 180 articles. And he has a passion for healthcare management, so much so that he created a master's level program for managers within healthcare called the International Masters for Health Leadership. Professor Mintzberg's original thinking and prolific writing has resulted in a mountain of accolades. To really grasp the breadth of his contributions, you can find out more in this week's License to Lead newsletter. You can also peruse his programs, book titles, blogs, videos, and even his beaver sculptures at mintzberg.org. The sculptures are kind of hard to describe, but I want to mention several of his books. He wrote Managers, Not MBAs, Rebalancing Society, and Managing the Myths of Healthcare. And here's a blurb about his latest book. Who better to write bedtime stories for managers than Henry Mintzberg of McGill University, purveyor of outrageous ideas that eventually become obvious? This is his 20th book, certainly his most playful and possibly his most serious. As you can imagine, I so enjoyed my conversation with Professor Mintzberg. Regular listeners might wonder why on earth I didn't bring up the data regarding better outcomes when physicians lead healthcare organizations. You know, the work of Amanda Goodall and others that I cite regularly. Well, I missed that opportunity. But my last question to him was, why did he agree to come on my podcast? His answer makes me think I might have another chance to explore all this physician leadership data with him. One last thing, please forgive the rough spots in the audio. We had an unstable internet connection, but you'll have no problem getting a great sense of Professor Mintzberg's perspectives, humor, and intellect. Here's our conversation. Professor Mintzberg, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Patty. It's a pleasure to be here.
Much of your work has focused on the need for managers to arise from an organization so that management is born of the people and products and culture of a specific business. So for my listeners who are probably more likely to be reading the New England Journal of Medicine than the Harvard Business Review, can you explain the basis of your concerns about where managers and leaders come from?
Well, leaders probably come from early life experience. Managers are not born so much as distorted when they go to business schools. I think business schools do very well at teaching marketing and finance and accounting. They don't teach management because management is a practice. You've got to be a manager before you can enhance that skill. You can't go in and become a manager in a business school. And in fact, the little data we have on MBAs as CEOs from Harvard and elsewhere is that they do worse and get paid more. Not a bad deal, I guess. Managers, therefore, come from experience. They come from sort of getting their feet wet in the organizations and the industries. So working in McDonald's and becoming a McDonald's manager doesn't exactly prepare you to become chief of oncology in a hospital. You've got to understand what you're managing. And too often we get people who don't understand.
Right.
In one business school near here, even business schools suffer from this. In one business school near here, they took the head of a trucking company to run the business school. And he claimed that managing professors was like managing truckers. And lo and behold, all the good professors left the place.
So your point then is that really, it doesn't even deserve the word management necessarily or manager if somebody's not intimately connected with and very conversant with what's actually going on in the core business.
Yeah, I mean, they may get the word manager, but they don't deserve to be managing the place. It's risky. Occasionally people can do it and make the conversion and do quite well. Much more often, these are disasters. Running a hospital is not like running a morgue. Well, maybe in part,
Not.
actually, but it's not like running an orchestra, managing an orchestra, or managing a baseball team. I mean, they're all unusual in their own way.
Right. And it's that culture and the products themselves and the people themselves. And that is so critical, I guess, to actually being able to understand well enough to lead in a way that's congruent with how the people in the organization think. So you talk about the propensity for business trained individuals who come from outside the core business to be remote control managers. And what does that term, that remote control managers, what does that imply?
Well, for example, it implies managing by the numbers. There have been occasional physicians talking about, railing on about people who manage by the numbers. Numbers are great in moderation, but especially with professional work where everything is so nuanced, like the work of physicians, numbers can be very dangerous. Look, if I need a very delicate, difficult operation, I'm going to find a surgeon who's got a high death rate, okay? Not because I'm looking for a bad surgeon, but because I'm looking for a surgeon who's done the difficult operations. Well, I've heard stories in the United States of surgeons who will not take on difficult operations because it spoils their success rate. None of us has ever met a number we can't game. And remote control management means we sit up in our offices, we don't connect with what's going on the ground, and we look at numbers. In a related kind of position, a friend of mine asked a very senior civil servant in the British health system why you measure so much. And he said, what else am I supposed to do when I don't know what's going on? And my reaction was, well, maybe he should get out of his office and find out what's going on. Another guy, senior civil servant on another side of similar activities in Britain, who was managing kind of the services for the handicapped, he said, in sharp contrast, he said, every Friday I go into the field. First, I spend an hour with the clients without the professionals. Then I spend an hour with the professionals without the managers. And then I spend an hour with the managers. All right, England's a big place, and he could spend years and not cover it all, but at least he'd get a sense on the ground of what's going on.
Yeah.
We've killed education through measurement, and we're in the process of killing a lot of healthcare through measurement.
Yeah, I love what you said about what else am I supposed to do when I don't know what's going on? And I think that's so much your point in a lot of what you've written. That is the reason why managers need to come from within and be connected to and understand the core business. So most of us, at least in the United States, have heard this criticism about how this place needs to be run more like a business. So you've written 20 books that seem to be primarily about management and leadership. Should I assume that you agree that healthcare organizations need to be run like a business?
No, you can put me down as decided. Let me start by saying this. Much business shouldn't be run like a business. And by that, I mean, shouldn't be run by the way it's popular now to run businesses, which is back to remote control management, relying on measurement, short term, overpaying senior executives, all kinds of things. And business is being ruined by these popular ways to run business. So the last model you would want to use in healthcare, whether it's hospitals or public health or whatever it is that business model. Healthcare is not a business. It's a calling. It's very different. There are aspects of healthcare that are businesses, like manufacturing masks for COVID and all that kind of thing. Of course, there are business aspects of healthcare. Healthcare itself, the service, is not business. It's a calling. And that makes it the people who do it much more effective when they can have that. If they're pressured by people who treat it running like a business, Hertzlinger at Harvard, who called the hospitals focused factories, for example, she was the most prominent healthcare management person at Harvard Business School, talking about focused factories. I couldn't think of anything worse for the people in those places than to be viewed that way.
Right. And can you say more about what that was about, the focused factories?
Well, this was a term that Hertzlinger used to describe hospitals. So you ask her what she means by that. I mean, basically what she means is the question you asked. You know, being a business is better. Donald Trump ran a business, therefore he could run the United States, except he ran his businesses into the ground and he helped run the United States into the ground. So we don't have a good record. Romney has not had a chance to be president of the United States, but the record of business people managing in government is not good. Americans have to get past that. They have to recognize that business is not the be-all and end-all of management. There are many, many, many other organizations that need to be managed differently.
Yeah, but it is still, the norm nowadays, even though it seems like people and esteemed professors from within a lot of business schools in the US as well that really point to this and are discouraged and write about it. The fact that what's going on with what I call the business school mindset, but running various organizations in a way that singularly looks at profits and often for the leaders. All this still is going on, even though there has been so many people writing and talking about it. And we still see people parachuting into all kinds of leadership positions that they're not, even familiar with the culture or the business. Do you have a way of explaining how we got into this pickle in the first place?
Well, it's all Horatio Algiers and all this, right? The American myth about business. And America has had huge success with its businesses and with business in general. Although if you look at the successes now, they're much more the startups on the part of entrepreneurs, usually not people who went to business school, whether it's Google or Apple or whatever. Look at Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, who in his lifetime created more business success, greater business success than any company in history. He, first of all, did not go to business school. Number two, he spent his mornings in the laboratory developing product. Now, I haven't read a lot of business articles in business journals or business publications that say chief executives should spend their morning developing product in the laboratory. It certainly worked for Jobs. We get into these dead ends and we have trouble getting out of them. One dead end is this idea that business is better and business does everything better and business is the way to go. And I think anybody who comes out of a business school should have a stamp on his or her forehead that says warning, like a skull and crossbones that says warning, not prepared to manage. Because they've been trained not to manage, they've been trained to calculate. They've been trained. Look, management is a practice where art, craft, and science meet, okay? You can't teach the art. Steve Jobs was the master of the art of managing. You can't teach the art. You don't teach the craft, you learn the craft through experience, okay? So business schools concentrate on the science. They concentrate on the numbers and the analysis. And some of that is important for management, but the essence of management is not in the science, it's in the art and the craft. And that's what makes it dangerous to train people initially in business schools. Look, we did a little study years ago where a book was published in Harvard about how wonderful the Harvard Business School was. And there's a table near the beginning of 19 of Harvard's greatest success stories up to that time. And so we looked at the record of those 19 people between 10 and 13 years later. 10 out of the 19 were total failures. I mean, total. I mean, they were fired. The company went bankrupt. I mean, total failure. A really bad merger. They were total failures. 4 more were questionable. So 5 out of the 19 were truly successful.
Wow. And I mean, Harvard offers a lot besides, that education. Harvard really gives you the jumpstart with all the connections and sort of a stamp of approval that is unlike, the vast majority that's pumping out 250,000 or 300,000 MBAs a year. You'd think with Harvard that it might be a higher percentage than 5 out of the 19.
There was a subsequent study that not of Harvard MBAs, but generally of MBAs compared to non-MBAs in CEO positions. And as mentioned before, they did worse, but got paid more. So
Right.
I have enough evidence to question the role of the MBA. And we'll come later to maybe how you do train managers.
Yes. So what traits do arise in people who are enmeshed in a profession or business that we're not going to find in somebody, even a brilliant somebody who pops into a business from the outside, clutching their MBA from an elite business school?
If you take medicine, for example, it's very nuanced. And the practice of medicine is very nuanced. The relationships, the professionals, the protocols, it's all very nuanced. It's hard to know all that if you're not part of that. There have been the occasional physician who's been to be political. I know you've never encountered one, but there are a couple here and there, and they can run circles around someone who doesn't know what's going on. For example, with regard to budgets, with regard to equipment, you're sitting in a managerial position to decide whether some department needs some $500 million or $500,000, whatever it is, piece of equipment. And how are you to know whether they're giving you a line or not? Well, you can use other physicians who I'm sure are ready to pounce on them and say, that guy doesn't deserve all that money because I deserve all that money. But then you get into these kind of fights. It's very hard to moderate between those fights if you're not, I'm not saying that not being a physician disqualifies you from managing a hospital. And I should add nursing, but we can come back to that. I think different points of view. But there are people who have done marvelously well because they're smart enough and nuanced enough and modest enough to know how to learn. So, of course, there are all kinds of people like that.
And are there other things that come to mind that there might not be? I mean, I might be pushing this more than it needs to be, but are there other traits that will come up in people who do know the core business that you've seen or that you've identified?
I'm going to talk about the opposite, if I may, which is what disqualifies physicians from managing hospitals. Doesn't mean they automatically qualify themselves at all, but there are characteristics of medicine that aren't the best for management. Number one, physicians always make a decision, a very explicit decision when they see a patient, even if that is to do nothing. Okay, but to do nothing, to do something, to prescribe, whatever it is. In management, the problem is to know when and whether you have to make a decision. So physicians largely work alone. Managers largely work in collaboration. Doesn't mean all physicians work alone, but medicine is not a collaborative activity for the most part. Management is. Nursing is much more collaborative activity than medicine. But we'll get back into that, I think, in a few minutes. But on the other hand, when I did my doctoral thesis, I studied 5 chief executives. One was the head of a school system, 3 were in business, and 1 was the head of a hospital. Quite a well-known hospital administrator named John Knowles, who ran the Massachusetts General Hospital. And he was, God, talk about collaborative. He was very social. There are all kinds of people. When I look at the possibilities of managing a hospital, the physicians have a couple of strikes against them. The nurses have one big strike against them because the physicians may not listen to them. And the MBAs and accountants and all those people have a major strike against them because they don't have the background in the field. So my conclusion, which is supported by all the data, is that nobody could possibly manage a hospital. I'd rather have to manage the most complex, Google than to manage a hospital because they're an incredibly complicated organization. Well, of course, somebody has to manage the hospital. And so they do pick people. And then there are sometimes an accountant who actually turns out to be not bad, and a physician who's great, and a nurse who's terrible, or a nurse who's great. So we're picking people, we're not picking categories to run hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
But if we start picking the category of you've got an MBA, therefore you can manage a hospital, is wrong. If you've got an MBA, that's no evidence that you know how to manage anything. But it means you better get past the analytical nature of training if you want to run a hospital.
Somebody with an MBA doesn't have any, on the basis of that, I think what I hear you saying is they don't have any qualifications to be a manager, basically, as a result of having an MBA.
You cannot create a manager in a classroom, period.
Right.
But then you can create a swimmer in a classroom.
That's a great one. I would like to challenge your comments about physicians not working in groups and, mostly working alone and maybe having some difficulty with dealing with ambiguity or making nuanced decisions. I did a podcast podcast number 2, I think it is, on the myths of physician leadership. And a lot of even physicians who write will spout these same myths. It kind of drives me nuts. But people will ask them a question like, well, what do you think accounts for your ability to, manage the Cleveland Clinic or, Mayo Clinic or whatever it might be? They'll end up just saying something. In a way, it's because that in itself is tacit knowledge. They grew up in this environment. They know medicine inside and out, and they know the business of medicine inside and out. And when somebody puts a microphone in their face and says, what accounts for your ability to manage? They say what pops into their brain. And by definition, don't recognize that they're unable to articulate all the tacit knowledge that goes into why they can lead. When I did this third podcast, I researched all these myths and looked at personality traits and types of physicians. And I'm probably not going to be able to recite it here, but they were above average on extroverted and amiable. And I think there was one where they were about the same as everybody else. And that one is leaving my brain. But I really dove into this. Do they manage money well? Well, they manage money better than people that are in the same salary group. I mean, Medscape they thought they finally debunked the thing about physicians can't manage money. When we make decisions in medicine, it's the whole gamut, everything from deciding how to talk to somebody on the phone who's a family member, or looking for resources for the department, aligning with nurses or with the ward clerk from hell, really figuring out how to work in teams, how to build alliances with people that don't like us. I just want to challenge this idea that physicians work alone and don't have the kind of, in general, and I think you're just saying in general, you said there are all kinds of docs that do a great job managing and leading, but I think actually in general, physicians are well suited to management and leadership.
Well, I don't think we're saying different things. I'll tell you what.
Okay.
I think what you're saying is those physicians who succeed in management have those characteristics. You mentioned extrovertedness and amiability, but I'll bet your experience, like mine, is some are amiable, some are extroverted, many are introverted, many are not amiable at all. I don't need to get kicks from my surgeon. I don't even know who my surgeon is if I'm just being wheeled into an operating room, meet the surgeon on the way in. And what I'm saying is the practice of medicine, look, there's a whole range. In geriatrics, for example, there's a lot more teamwork because the cases are much more complicated. And one physician in Montreal said that a physiotherapist was his best diagnostician because they collaborate on diagnosis. But most physicians don't. The idea of collaboration for many physicians is in the old days at least, you scribbled a few words on a piece of paper, sent it off to a specialist and got a few words scribbled back. That's not collaboration. If you watch an open heart surgery operation or any complicated operation, the surgeons and the anesthetists and the nurses don't speak to each other or barely speak to each other because they're all programmed to know exactly what to expect of each other. That's not collaboration. That's programming. That's pre-programmed, pre-structured. And of course, then there are all the physicians who work in individual practice. Look, you rarely go into a physician's office and see 2 or 3 people there consulting on your problem. You go in and see a single physician.
I actually think some of the corporatized medicine has made it less possible for physicians to collaborate in the way that feels fantastic. I mean, I used to have a group that I would run for elderly patients and have, between 12 and 20 patients in a group and have a clinical pharmacist in there and a clerk and an RN. And I would bring in other physicians to give talks. I mean, it can be fantastic. And I guess too, Henry, when I was talking about the physician personality traits, it was a bunch of residents and a bunch of physicians. I think it was thousands and thousands of physicians. And it was looking at in general. So they were compared to the general population. And it's not like every physician is extroverted. That's certainly not true. But it's a little bit more than the population. And they're a little bit more, on average, more amiable than the population.
Okay.
That's all. And I'm railing, I guess, against a stereotype too about decision-making. And even the example that you give, if things are going well, it's fantastic. I'm not used to thinking about the surgical suite as being completely silent. Usually there's a lot of interaction and discussion, but that's not my bailiwick. So I don't know in general what's true. But I think that highly technical procedural orientation that's exactly where we do want that sort of clear hierarchy and absolute expertise like that. And then when things go to hell in a handbasket, then there's a lot of discussion and a real need then to move away from any kind of rote procedure. Then you need the expert to take charge and gather the information that's needed and manage the urgent situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that completely. And the best practice is collaborative. Some of it. And I love the stories of collaboration like the one you just told. I think they're wonderful. I'm just saying that if you look at the total of what all physicians do, not every single physician, but physicians in general, largely work alone compared to other professions, other work where they work largely in groups and largely together. But of course, I always tell the joke about if you're being wheeled into an operating room and the nurse bends and says, you have nothing to worry about. This is a really creative physician, a really creative surgeon. Mm-hmm. And I don't want a creative surgeon. Thank you. I want a surgeon who's done this a million times. But of course, if something goes wrong in that room, then I do want a creative surgeon.
Right.
I'm just saying, how often are physicians doing creative work and how often are they following protocols? And so that's it. I wanted to say something else about earlier, what you said about being able to articulate your own management capabilities. I'm really glad to hear that because I wouldn't have a job if managers could articulate their own management capabilities. That's left to people like me to try and figure out what their capabilities are. Because you said before about asking about the traits of managers, and managers not being able to say what their traits are.
Oh.
Because it's an implicit kind of practice and not a profession. We don't have sort of standard procedures, and they're usually wrong or dangerous. Managers get the exceptions. They get the things that nobody else can handle. So you can't use pat answers for management. So it's a complicated practice. And, of all the books that have been written about management, thousands of them, I can remember two in particular that were written by chief executives. One was published in 1916 and saw managing as completely controlling and nothing but controlling. Very distorted view. The other was by the chief executive of New Jersey Bell way back when. And he was a real theoretician, very unusual, very, very articulate. But that's unusual. So I was just talking about that. As far as extroverted or amiable, I guess the real comparison would be if managers in general, how they come out on extrovert and amiable, because even if physicians are a little more than average, my guess is that managers would be a lot more than average.
Oh, yeah.
Managers a lot more than average, including average physicians. Mm-hmm. Some of my best friends are physicians, right?
Right. In order to be a best friend, they better be amiable.
Let me tell you a story. It might fit in somewhere, or it might fit in. So I wrote this book called Managing the Myths of Healthcare. And I talk a lot about how managers drive physicians crazy because of all this measuring and bureaucracy and hierarchy and all this stuff. And the old story about when you become a manager, you're no longer a physician. He's no longer one of us. She's no longer one of us because you become a manager. My reaction is always to say, well, maybe we'll put an accountant in as head of medical services instead of physician. But my daughter, Susie, who has spent many years working with psychiatrists and working as a social worker in mental health, said, you know what? Everything you say about managers coming down heavy on physicians, you could say the same thing about physicians in mental health coming down heavy on social work. It's the social workers who know what's going on with the patients and their families, not the psychiatrists. They're the ones who are remote control and removed. I kind of found that amusing.
Yeah, well, it's amusing and tragic, at the same time. But I think even the psychiatrists might, at least to some degree, agree with that they have been so commoditized that they've got a role and it's distributing pills, and nobody's going to pay for a psychiatrist to actually talk to a human being about their problems. And that, I think, is a result of this whole medical industrial complex as it's. So we have talked about leadership and some of the real deficiencies in expecting a manager to emerge from a business school or somebody clutching an MBA to actually be a manager as a result of having that MBA. So what are business schools doing with graduate business education if they're not, I guess, like Harvard advertises? Harvard says they're preparing people for the highest levels of leadership, and Stanford says they're developing innovative principled leaders who will change the world. But if that's not what's going on, what is the purpose? What are they doing?
Well, that's promotion.
Right.
That's promotion. What they're doing that's positive is they're researching and developing the business functions. They do that very well. If you want to learn about marketing and finance and accounting and that kind of thing, business schools are the place to go. If you want to learn about managing, conventional business school programs are not the place to go. As I said, you can't create a manager in a classroom, so it's nonsense to take someone who's had a couple of years of business experience and pretend you're turning them into managers. It's distorting. But people are breaking down the doors to get in because of the huge salaries they get, especially in finance. And the old boys network, because it's mostly boys, projects them into senior positions where they screw up much of the time. Mm-hmm. But of course, in my case, what a business school has done is given me the opportunity to do the kind of research I want to do and write books about how business schools don't train managers. So that's better coming out of a business school maybe than out of a political science department or a sociology or anthropology department, because nobody will listen to them and they'll listen more to me because I'm an insider. Here we go again with insiders and outsiders.
That's a great point. Well, let's talk money. So what do you think of the supersized CEO salaries? The Banner, for instance, the Banner CEO, that's a big healthcare system in the US, and it's not for profit, I kid you not, but the Banner CEO made $26 million in 2017 in this not-for-profit system. So can we assume that his performance and outcomes justify this kind of salary? How do you size that up?
Well, first of all, I think people like that and the boards who appoint them belong in jail, frankly. They are just throwing away public or institutional money. Anybody who insists on being paid a huge premium over the people they're managing are not leaders, period, by definition. Because their salaries are sending out a message that they are, to use the figures for business, 300 or 400 times as important as the people they manage, or at least as the workers they manage. That's not leadership. That's the opposite of leadership. And it just breeds a kind of narcissism. Look, I'm not a fan of the word leadership, frankly, because the word leadership implies a single individual, like somebody pulling down $26 million. Leadership always points to an individual. I'm a fan of what I call communityship, people working together. And even though I argue that physicians normally don't work together. In the management of hospitals, you have to work together. You have to collaborate. Management is a collaborative activity. And when somebody singles him or herself out for that kind of income or allows the board to do that, look, the boards are rewarding themselves by saying, we are so smart that we picked the best chief executive on earth, and therefore we have to pay that person obscenely. This is just nonsense. It's beyond nonsense. But, we got the best person on earth who we had to pay $26 million to get. And I'm saying if you had to pay if they were willing to accept $26 million, they have no business managing anything because they are so self-focused and narcissistic, just in the very fact of accepting a salary like that, which is utterly dysfunctional. It sends the wrong message to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So,
wow, yes.
Put me down as undecided.
So can we assume his performance and outcomes justify this, and I should put you down as undecided?
Yeah, put me down as undecided.
So another money-related question. I recently had Alfie Cohn on the podcast, and he just railed against incentives. And do you have thoughts about incentives or incentives in healthcare?
Yes, I think a patient who has had their life saved and is really appreciative is a terrific incentive. I think it's the best incentive you can possibly have.
Yes.
But giving cookies, as you wrote about or quoted me about something else, treating physicians like pigeons in a cage and giving them little rewards when they hit the right bell is just silliness.
It is just such a demeaning statement to imply that a physician needs a cookie in order to do the right thing. And I think in your book, you talked about that really depriving physicians of, it's another hit against professionalism, was one of the comments that I read.
Yeah.
In the US, private equity companies have entered pretty much every nook and cranny of healthcare. And what do you see when the kind of for-profit or private equity dollars get invested into healthcare or similar organizations?
Well, here's where the US and Canada part company, right? Because this is a very American phenomenon. Not that there aren't shades of it here, but nothing like that here. Healthcare is, we have Medicare. Did I mention before about $2.50?
Yes, you did. With your open heart surgery, your quadruple bypass. And it was to have the television.
Yeah, I had quadruple bypass and I had to pay $2.50 because we rented a television set. US, it would probably cost a fortune to rent that television set, let alone get a bypass operation. So we don't have that problem largely in Canada. Americans claim instead we have this problem of long waiting lists. I don't think we have nearly the problem of long waiting lists compared to non-rich people in the United States or in Britain, the people who bypass the NHS and go to private healthcare. But in France, for example, people have that choice. But for minor things, they'll go to private clinics. But for serious things, they go to public hospitals.
Wow.
Yeah, that's common in France. Treating healthcare as a business is dysfunctional. I'm not talking about making masks or equipment. I'm talking about medical services. It's dysfunctional because, as I said before, healthcare is a calling, and the best physicians treat it as a calling and are proud of the fact. And the ones who are just looking at their patients as dollar signs are not a credit to their profession.
Yes, well said. So it'd be great to move a little bit into talking about some solutions here. And I know that that's an area of interest for you. And to start with, you founded a program called the International Masters for Health Leadership. And you've had a lot of years of cohorts participating in the program. What are the headlines for you? What have you learned, or how has your thinking shifted as a result of this program?
Well, for one thing, it's absolutely, utterly wonderful. And I'm not saying that to promote it, although I'm promoting it, but it is so engaging for the people. The average age is about in the 40s, but ranges from the 30s to the 70s. They are there because they're absolutely dedicated. And when I ask, they come from all over the world. They come from all aspects of healthcare. That in itself is wonderful. One comment we get very often from, for example, surgeons or regular physicians is, I never understood public health until I came to this program, and I have colleagues who work in public health, and now I know what public health is. So there's an engagement and an activity in the class. They don't sit and get lectured at. They sit at round tables. They spend half their time talking to each other and learning from each other's own experience, because the power of academic education is enabling experienced people to share their experience with each other, to reflect on their experience and share it with each other. And that's what we do. And they absolutely love it. They come from all over the world. And so a nurse from Papua New Guinea, we've never had anybody from Papua New Guinea, but a nurse from Ethiopia, we've had several physicians from Ethiopia. Physician from Ethiopia suddenly finds herself learning from a nurse who works with the Inuit in northern Canada, okay? As far apart as two contexts could be, and yet they realize the commonalities and they learn enormously. So I poll the class usually at the beginning. What are you here for? How many of you are here to develop yourselves? How many of you are primarily? How many of you are here to develop your organization or your public health department or whatever? And how many of you are here for healthcare? The vast majority are always there for healthcare. And that's the mood in the class. They're there to improve healthcare. Wow. And they're really devoted. It's wonderful. You have to come in that class. Anybody who comes in that class, if it's possible, join the class, because they can't believe what's going on in the place. And it's not, we're not geniuses. We're just doing the most natural things in the world. We're taking people who are experienced, we're tapping into that experience, and we're enabling them to share that experience. And we drop in our pearls of wisdom, about theory and different things. But it's to them to run with it or not, depending on how relevant it is to them. And they run with it together. They don't run with it alone.
I love that, Henry. That just sounds remarkable. It sounds like, do you have kind of a body of knowledge or writings that come out of those programs?
Well, a lot of the stories are on the website. Some of those stories. The story we have is a woman who was an emergency room physician in a children's hospital in Montreal who volunteered with Doctors Without Borders regularly. And one day she comes up to me and she says, I think I'm going to run for the worldwide presidency of Doctors Without Borders. Next thing you know, she's running and her team was made up of people in the class. She was elected. She served a second term, which they're only allowed 2. So for the past 8 years or so, she's been running Doctors Without Borders worldwide. She arrived at the beginning of the crisis in Africa, the Ebola crisis. And Joanne knew, and Doctors Without Borders knew what was going on the ground in those countries, those 3 or 4 countries where it started. They knew what was happening. And she knew that she couldn't blow the whistle on it, but the head of the WHO had to do that. So she went to see the head of the WHO who declared that pandemic. And then you know the story because the rest was in the news. Joanne, a few years later, was on the list of the 100 most influential women managers in the world. And that's our proudest story. None of the others are as dramatic as that, but there are all kinds of stories that are sort of similar of people who just were so influenced by this whole sort of shocking way of thinking about management compared to what they had seen and experienced.
And it allows them to see themselves differently, redefine themselves, and management and leadership becomes part of that definition. So they're willing to raise their hands. They've got some new tools and new colleagues.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. It seems so critical that things do change. We have so many issues, certainly in the United States, with healthcare. So creating something new is critical. And you've addressed this in your book, Rebalancing Society. Would you talk about this vision that you have for rebalancing society?
Yeah. So in 1991, I visited Prague. This is 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the conclusion then was that capitalism had triumphed, that this was a battle between capitalism and communism, and capitalism had triumphed, which was dead wrong. The capitalism didn't triumph, balance triumphed, because the successful countries of the West were balanced across three sectors of society, the public and private sectors, and what I call the plural sector or civil society. And by the way, healthcare is very significantly delivered in the plural sector. I think 7% of American hospitals are called voluntary, come under the category of voluntary. Is that right? It's something like that.
I'm not familiar with that term. We talk about the private and the not-for-profit and public. I'm not sure about...
Yeah, I think voluntary and not-for-profit are the same. They're neither owned by investors nor owned by government.
Yes, right.
So most of the healthcare in the United States, most of the hospitals and many other healthcare services are not delivered in the private sector or in the public sector. There is, of course, the veterans hospitals, but they're delivered by the plural sector, which means what I call non-owned or member-owned organizations. So Kaiser Permanente would be member-owned, and many, many hospitals, in fact, almost all the famous hospitals in the United States are non-owned. Nobody owns the Mayo Clinic, nobody owns the Cleveland Clinic, the Mass General, and so on and so forth. They're not owned by investors, they're not owned by government. So a healthy society balances the three sectors. And as you can see, healthcare and a lot of education in the United States is plural sector. Well, the Eastern European countries were out of balance on the public sectors. Government controlled everything. Whereas in the West, at that time, government was strong, business was strong, and the plural sector was strong. Community sector was strong. The belief that capitalism triumphed has enabled capitalism to triumph ever since. And that's precisely what you were asking me about at the beginning of our conversation, that capitalism is making all these inroads into healthcare where it does not belong. Okay? I'm not saying business doesn't belong in aspects. As I said, we want CAT scans from businesses, CAT scan machines, not CAT scan services, but CAT scan machines from businesses. So this imbalance is killing us. And no country is farther along on that path than the United States and Britain. The two great liberal democracies are destroying themselves. Look, the Supreme Court of the United States legalized bribery. In the Citizens United decision, They legalized bribery. That's what they did.
Mm-hmm.
And they're destroying democracy.
Yeah.
It's destroying democracy in the United States because capitalism has been trying. So rebalancing society is my effort. First, a book called Rebalancing Society, and more importantly, a website called rebalancengsociety.org that people can peruse in about 10 minutes to get a sense of where we are and where we need to go.
Yes. When you talk about how capitalism has made its inroads in these malevolent ways, it makes me think of the business school mindset. I define as that exemplifying the greed is good angle of capitalism, or certainly of I think of the curriculum that often comes out of business schools.
There are three dimensions to that I use. One is greed is good, one is markets are sufficient, and one is governments are suspect. Those three go together.
Okay. And when you say that, explain the second two. I think I understand the greed is good.
Markets are sufficient. Everything can be handled by markets. If we need prisons, let companies run prisons, let companies run hospitals. Markets will solve all the problems. And you get somebody like Michael Porter talking excessively about measurement in healthcare, as if somehow if we measure everything, we'll improve healthcare. And as I said earlier, measurement distorts. Some measures are good, and you have to measure certain things. You need budgets. Obviously, you need budgets. But this obsession with measurement, which comes from market forces, basically, if we can measure, therefore we can have private hospitals and private healthcare, business private. It's this idea of let the market choose, let the commercial market choose, let supply and demand choose. And it doesn't apply the same way in callings like healthcare.
Right. Yes, that would be fantastic to do a much deeper dive into that. I would love to ask you some quick hitters. Are you up for that?
Sure.
All right. So number one, why is your Twitter handle Mintzberg 141?
Because Twitter used to be 140 characters. And I wanted to have it as 140 plus, but it wouldn't take a plus sign because I use Twitter as I call it a twog, tweet to blog. So all my tweets, especially in the early years, were intended to take people to my blogs.
That's funny. I had no idea that there was going to be a story behind 141. So how do you compensate the beavers for the artwork that you collect from them?
The beavers just love, like all artists, to be displayed, apparently. It's one time at our dock, our lake is called La Castor, which means beaver. And one time this log appeared at the dock. It just floated to the dock. And the kids said, look, the artists are delivering their work straight to the museum. So it must be that they just like being displayed. But I'm nice to them. I never take the beaver sculptures off the dams or the lodges. I only take what they leave behind. And frankly, it makes sense because what they put on the dams and lodges don't have any branches. They've all been cut off. Otherwise, they couldn't drag them up. Whereas my favorite ones have all kinds of stuff sticking out because they hadn't gotten around to taking that off.
So that is so generous of you to provide gallery space for the beaver artists. I think that's great.
Yeah, all over our living room. But you know what the funny part is? Nobody ever comments. People who haven't been to the house never look and say, gee, what's all that?
All right. Number three of your favorite traits of your partner, Dulcie.
I did a chapter in a book on management talking about what are the most important traits of successful managers. And I found a list of 7 that was missing traits. So I put together the traits of successful managers I could possibly find, and it came to 52. Now, if I added kryptonite to that list, even Superman wouldn't be able to satisfy all those. But Dulcie has 52 wonderful traits, and I couldn't even begin to pick 3. I mean, she's wonderful, and we have a great relationship.
Wonderful.
So we wouldn't deem to even narrow it down to 3.
Yeah, ridiculous of me to even suggest that there would only be 3. What was I thinking? All right, here's number 4. You've written 20 books. You have endless honorary degrees and honors. Do you think of yourself as an overachiever or an underachiever or something else?
I picture myself as an achiever.
Ooh.
I certainly don't have to underachieve. That's evident. I don't set out to overachieve. I just have a lot of energy and I love to do what I do.
An achiever. All right. Next one. What is your favorite depiction of a leader in a movie? Now, I say movie, a more intellectual person would probably say film.
I love movies and I love fictional movies. And we saw a terrific one last night and all that. But if I had to pick, I think I'd pick The Three Roosevelts. It's a Netflix documentary I think it's Netflix. It's about 7 or 10 parts. The Three Roosevelts are obviously Teddy, FDR, and Eleanor. And particularly FDR was an amazing human being.
Super. So it's not a movie or a film. It's a Netflix limited series. Here's my final question. Remind me again, why did you agree to be on my podcast? All
of the above. Everything we've done, all your questions, all your challenges, all this discussion. You know, when I'm asked to be, I usually say yes if it seems reasonable, but I try to sort of out how serious this is, how serious the person is, how deep they want to go into it, whether they've taken some effort to find out who I am and all that. And you scored A+ on all that. And I think it shows in this conversation.
Wow. Well, I am so happy that you did agree. So, Professor Mintzberg, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
It's wonderful, Patty, and wonderful to have this discussion. Keep well.
Thanks for listening to the License to Lead podcast. Be sure to visit licensed2leadpodcast.com to join the conversation, access the show notes, and sign up for our newsletter. Leave us a message with your provocative question or your thoughtful comments. You might inspire a future episode of the License to Lead podcast. Thanks so much, everyone.